Hi, welcome to our presentation for high purity sulfuric acid contamination prevention. Today, we will discuss what makes a high purity sulfuric acid load special above standard sulfuric acid. We will show you what you can do to help maintain its purity from the time it leaves the production site to a delivery customer's location, with making the connections cleanly, returning the hoses back onto the unit in a sterile condition, and good practices while using your PPE. Hazmat Environmental Group has been a business partner with PBS Chemicals since 1999. This is a long-term relationship that has come to mature with excellence in customer satisfaction. Our hazmat drivers have also given our best professional services and exemplary safety standards to PBS Chemicals and their customers. To continue with these standards, we want to expand our understanding to include a commitment of purity in our delivery process concerning hoses, gaskets, and flanges when dealing with high purity sulfuric acid. PBS Chemical Solutions in Buffalo, New York manufactures and distributes high purity sulfuric acid to the reagent and electronic grade marketplace. The high purity sulfuric acid made at PBS is some of the highest purity acid in the world, and the customers receiving this acid are some of the most strict and demanding customers they have encountered. To ensure that customers receive the highest purity sulfuric acid possible, the acid is not only manufactured using highly specialized equipment, the acid is also shipped in high purity trailers and containers. The trailers and containers have special linings that maintain the high purity, no contact with metals or plastics. Even the hoses used to unload at customer sites are Teflon lined and must be carefully handled to prevent any contamination from entering the customer storage tanks. There have been several issues involving contaminated transfer hoses, and this presentation will explain the proper and accepted handling and securement of hoses used for high purity sulfuric acid. For high purity sulfuric acid deliveries, PBS purchases 2-inch convoluted Teflon hoses with a stainless steel wire braid covering with a crimp style 2-inch stainless steel flange. The high purity sulfuric acid hoses are then sealed inside a helical stainless steel armor. These hoses are very clean, durable, kink resistant, and also have a tight bend radius. This 2-inch hose is designed for a maximum working pressure of 525 pounds per square inch. To properly secure a hose, a collection of fittings, gaskets, and fasteners are required. Shown here, 2-inch flange hose, 5/8 diameter and 3-inch long bolt and nut, 2-inch blank flange CPVC, 2-inch full-face Teflon blank gasket, 2-inch Teflon ring gasket. The best sealing technique is to use a full-face Teflon blank gasket and a Teflon ring gasket. The full-face gasket protects the hose, and the ring gasket provides good sealing while in transit and while at a customer site. Slide 2 or 3 bolts into the flanges for alignment, then install the ring gasket. Evenly tighten the nuts and bolts a little at a time to bring the flanges squarely together. Be sure to use the star pattern to evenly snug, then tighten the nuts and bolts. Bolt threads should be evenly protruding from the nuts. Proper wrenches for this are 1 1/16 inch and 15/16 inch. Now, if the nuts and bolts are tightened in an uneven pattern, the blank flange and the gasket will not mate properly to the hose flange, and a leak will occur. Be sure to use the correct length bolts. If the bolts are too short, the nuts will not fully engage, and the joint connections will not be strong. A few threads should be protruding from the nut. If the bolts are too long, the nuts will bottom out on the shoulder, and the nut will feel tight, but the flange will not be sealed. Please make sure to install the blank flange properly. If the sealing surface is not facing the gasket, a seal will not be formed. Many blank flanges will have a phonographic finish on the gasket surface. Alternately, any writing on the flange should be outward facing. Note the numbers on the flange in the example, prompting the use of the star pattern for tightening. This is the outside of the flange. Shown here are two examples of blank flanges that were installed backwards. The photo on the right resulted in the trailer being rejected by a high purity sulfuric acid customer. A full face Teflon blank gasket must be used with all CPVC blank flanges. If only a ring gasket is used, as shown here, the flange will be sealed, but the sulfuric acid can come in contact with the CPVC. Here was an issue that developed at a customer location that resulted in a trailer rejection. The trailer hose had not been secured with a full-face gasket. This allowed residual sulfuric acid in the hose to come into contact with the CPVC blank flange. When the hose was being readied for connection for delivery to the customer's storage tank, black liquid came out of the hose. Strong sulfuric acid will react with the CPVC and char the plastic. This does not render the blank flange unsafe, but it does lead to hose contamination. This photo shows that by using a ring gasket with a hole in the middle, sulfuric acid can contact the CPVC blank flange and cause the acid in the hose to turn black. Some of PVS's hoses are fitted with Teflon-lined stainless steel blank flanges. With a Teflon liner permanently mounted onto the blank flange, a full-face Teflon blank gasket is not needed. However, a ring gasket is still required. As a summation, the best practice for preventing hose contamination is to use a full-face Teflon blank gasket along with a ring gasket. This combination will prevent hose contamination and will seal the hose while in transit. Also, the ring gasket will be available for sealing the hose flange to the customer's hookup. When at a customer's facility, carefully remove the blank flange and full-face Teflon blank gasket from the hose ends and mate the 2-inch flange to the customer's pipeline. Connect the hose flange to the customer's receiving flange and make sure to seal this joint with the ring gasket. Please be aware that there may be some residual acid in the hoses. Be careful when removing the blank flange. Once the trailer load of high purity sulfuric acid has been delivered into the customer tank, blow the trailer hose clear or walk the hose to remove as much acid from the hose as possible. After disconnecting the hose, reseal the delivery hose using the same flange gasket, nuts, and bolts set up with the accompanied delivery. Note, if acid remains in the hose, this will become a safety problem for the next driver making a delivery with that trailer. Also, if acid remains in the hose, there's a greater chance for contamination. The photo on the bottom right is of a hose at a customer delivery. The hose still contained residual acid that had leaked into the hose tube because the blank flange was installed backwards. The customer rejected this load. These customers of high purity sulfuric acid will refuse any load that comes in for delivery when the delivery hose is not capped off correctly or if the hose looks contaminated. For these reasons alone, all hoses should be carefully examined by the driver before leaving the PVS facility with a high purity sulfuric acid tank load. Please remember, if you notice anything that doesn't look right before delivery or if any problems arise during the delivery process, stop and communicate with dispatch. These loads are very important to the success of Hazmat and PVS's working partnership.
Safety note: whenever using acid hoses or acid-related equipment, always use your blue acid gloves over your nitrile gloves. Shown here is the CPVC flange. Notice the side that is facing outwards. To break down this connection, you will need 2 wrenches when breaking the bolts and the nuts. Be careful when separating the nuts off the bolts and separate the flange as to not drop the Teflon ring gasket. You will need to use this ring gasket to connect your delivery hose to the customer to receiving tank or line. Make sure this gasket is clean and white when being used. Notice the white blank flange being used. It should be clean on the side facing the ring gasket. Now notice the CPVC flange is only used to sandwich the ring gasket and the blank flange together. Make sure only Teflon comes in contact with any material before, during, and after any delivery. Notice here how 2 of the bolts are welded to make it easier to break the nuts free with only the need of having 1 wrench. When taking the blank flange off, it is much easier to control the bolts when flipping it over. Look how you can see the white of the Teflon. By removing the ring gasket and the blank flange gasket, you can see another type of flange. This is the Teflon line stainless steel blank flange. This has Teflon embedded into the hose side of the blank flange. Do not install this flange backwards, as only the Teflon side should face the hose side itself. When putting this flange back together, they still install the blank flange gasket, then the ring gasket. Notice it is still much easier to connect the 2 sides together when the bolts are welded together. Here our driver Tim is wearing his company uniform when interacting with the customer, but it's not safe enough to use for unloading. Now Tim is dressed for success, wearing a full acid suit. Note the safety goggles are unvented. These should always be used with a face shield and hard hat. Tim also is wearing his acid gloves over nitrile gloves as well. Here, driver Tim will place a drip bucket underneath the discharge valves before loosening and removing the blind flange. You can see here Tim is loosening all 4 nuts from the bolts, but not removing them completely. Now Tim takes the open end of the wrench and spreads the flange to allow any residual material to flow safely into the drip bucket. When satisfied, Tim removes the 4 nuts and blind flange and places them aside for later. Now Tim takes the high pure delivery hose and removes the 4 nuts. Notice how he takes the bottom two off first, sets them aside, loosens the top two, takes them off by hand, and sets them aside as well. Now Tim inspects the gasket, makes sure it looks good, puts it in place between the 4 bolts, and he carefully marries the hose flange to the 4 bolts by holding the back nuts with his fingers. Keeping the pressure there, he will add the 2 screw-on nuts by fingers, 1 and 2. That will hold the hose in place while he reaches down and puts on nut number 3, spins it into place, and nut number 4. Tim uses the wrench to tighten the 2 bolts diagonally first. And he gets them so they just get just about tight. He's not ratcheting them down tight. Now he goes to the second 2 bolts and gets them to just catch. Now he will take and tighten down the bolts evenly and diagonally. Now he's done 2 diagonal bolts here. Now he's grabbing the 1 here and doing the opposite one near the bottom, pulling up. He is satisfied that they're tight. Tim will now engage the hydraulic switch and pump up the internal valve. He's looking underneath to see that the indicators show that the valve is open. Now he can twist open the external valve partially to check for signs of leaks at the connections. When empty, close the external valve, then the hydraulic internal valve by flipping the lever switch. You'll never begin to loosen the nuts on the delivery hose until you are sure there is no pressure left on the hose. Tim is now loosening the bottom 2 nuts and removing them. He is now loosening the top 2 nuts, lifting up on the hose to let out any liquid, and then removing the top 2 nuts. Tim is now removing the hose. After placing the 4 bolts, Tim places the ring gasket between the 4 bolts. Then he places the Teflon gasket over that. Then he will sandwich that with the outer flange, making sure the inside and the outside are put on correctly. Now he finger tightens each one of the nuts back on top of the flange. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Once again, Tim starts to tighten the nuts in a diagonal pattern, starting on 2 diagonal sides first. He then moves to the opposite diagonals and does the same thing, making sure that all 4 bolts and nuts are tight. Tim will now cap off the trailer with the 4-bolt flange that originally came with, tightening up the same way he connected the delivery hose the first time. First, remove the outer acid gloves while leaving the internal nitrile gloves on. Before removing your nitrile gloves, here you can remove the rest of your PPE. Then lastly, remove the nitrile gloves and dispose of them responsibly. This concludes our presentation for high purity sulfuric acid contamination prevention.
Thank you for your time, and please have a safe day.